In this video, we're going to be doing the second part of our pepper drawing, which is adding the shading and value. Remember, we are shading for three things. We are shading for form first, color second, and value and texture last. I'm not going to shade and finish the whole drawing in this demonstration. I'm going to give you enough information so you can see how to start, and then you will finish your own drawing. Think about when we talked about the value scale. Highlights are a very important part of the value scale. They are the lightest part of an object. So let's take a look at some. On this first pepper, this is a large highlight, and we have some smaller ones. There's a little bit of highlight here. There's a highlight here. There's a highlight here. And there's a highlight here with a teeny bit of shadow in between. Going to the pepper behind, on these front lobes of the pepper, there's a lot of highlight. There's highlight on the stem, and there's highlight on each of the lobes in the back, but the strongest light is on the first two. On the dark green pepper in the back, the highlights on the shoulder, and on different parts of the stem, mostly on the top side, and each lobe of the pepper has some of that highlight. Then it is darker here, and there is a little bit lighter value here, and again, it's not as strong a highlight as the ones in the front. That is how we build the form. Even our smaller peppers have highlight here, highlight on the shoulder, and a smaller highlight on the other one. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to start, like we did with our drawing, with our first pepper. And I see that I want to include or bring this shoulder down a little bit here first. So I'm looking for the shape of the highlight. That's going to be where I'm having no shading at all. And I see on this shoulder, there's some highlight here. There's a shadow space right here. And sometimes highlights look circular, sometimes they look more rectangular, sometimes they're long and unbroken. So you really have to look at each one. It's sort of like looking at the personality. All right, let's come to the back one. It's always a good idea to work around your drawing instead of finishing one object totally start to finish. And let's move to this big one over here. There's a large highlight right here. That's maybe the biggest one. And we can always change the shape and adjust the shape of our highlights as we add our shading. And there's quite a large highlight here on the stem that's stronger, and one here. Okay, and now I'm ready to start shading. I'm going to start with the front. And remember, we have two ways to shade. We can use the side of our pencil, as we did in our intersecting circle assignment project. And we can use the tip. So just like with our intersecting circles, though, we don't want hard edges. Shadows are generally soft edged. And so as I'm shading, I'm trying to go with the shape or the surface of the form. I can always add more shading later. How is the form turning? And this pepper changes value here. So we have a darker edge here and a lighter area, and then a darker area here. It's not as dark, even though it's on the bottom, it's not as dark. Okay, we had our dimple in here. How does that shadow come around? How does it come around the other side? What is that shape? How is the light moving over the object? How is the shape and the shadow moving over the object? So this is how we build the form, but also how we show the value of the object, of our pepper in this case. Highlights are almost never at the edge. They're more on the interior. How is the light going over the form? How is the shadow going over the form? Now, I will need to come back and add a greater variation because the light on the top and the light on the side are not the same. But I'm just trying to sort of establish the direction of the lights and the shadows over the form of the pepper. And let's see what's going on up here. This is not a highlight. So for my drawing to really come alive, I'm going to need light values, medium values, dark values, and things in between. Now I see right up here at the top, if I look up here, there's the highlight and it's light on this side and much darker on this side. So I don't have to have that totally finished right now, but I do want the form to start separating out. Okay, all right, so I'll probably come back and work on that some more. But next I'm going to move up here to the stem, and it looks like it doesn't exactly have a highlight. It's a little bit more dull, but it's darker on the inside and darker here. And this end, I'm changing direction of the pencil. It's kind of rough. So this might be a good place to use some texture marks like we did on our banana. Okay, all right. So now if I compare this pepper to what's behind it, the green pepper behind is very much dark, and I don't want it to be a spot, so I have to think, how is that dark going to carry through on the other side? So we're going to follow this rib, but if I look, I'll notice that it has a shape. It's not just a line, and it comes over. You'll notice I changed the pressure on my pencil. So I'm sort of working from the edge out, and I need the pepper to be darker than the stem. So you notice my paper's not nailed to the table. I want to be sure that I'm carefully shading, so it's okay to turn your paper while you're working. So you can see that I'm already building the contrast here. The bottom is dark, but it's not dark everywhere. So there's a little highlight right here. Let's get in that shape on the side. So on this one, on the side, I'm going to come in a little lighter first, and then I will go back and add the dark. It's not really complicated if I take one part at a time. Okay, so now I have this lobe. So if I'm looking at the edge of this lobe, there's a highlight on this edge. So when I start my shading, I'm going to leave a little space for the highlight that's on that edge. And I'm going to get that going and then turn my paper again so I'm working the direction. Each lobe seems to have a darker edge. Okay, so I have to decide, is it darker on the one behind or darker on the one in front? They cannot be the same. So again, that is how I'm lightening my pressure there. That is how I build the value and the form. If I look next to the stem, this lobe is pretty dark. So I'm going to have that be dark. And it will be lighter at the top. We talked about how there's some highlight in the top. Okay, I'm going to come back to the stem. I'm going to finish the pepper first. So now I'm going to move up here to this shoulder. I have my big highlight, and I see it has kind of a tail coming down. So I'll put in some value first. That's kind of a medium value. And a little bit darker here. It's medium around this edge. And the medium goes into the highlight area just a little bit and comes back down. Now again, compared to the stem of the pepper that's in front, it's very dark. And how does that dark travel through? It cannot just be on the top, it needs to travel through. So I'm going to start right up next to my stem of the first pepper and come down. And I also don't want to shade into the pepper at the bottom, my first pepper. Okay, and we'll follow around and shade up. Not going over my highlights. And this is quite dark over here on the side. Very, very dark. And very dark in here. I can always smooth it as I go, and I have a little more dark in here. But I do want to see that this shoulder, this piece of the pepper is different from this piece, so I don't want those to run together. Okay. All right, now before I move on, let's do a little bit on the stem. The highlights here in the middle, this form is going vertically. So I'm going to do a little bit of line vertically. I don't want to cover up my highlight. And here at the edge, I have to decide, is the edge darker or the pepper darker? And I'm going to go with the pepper behind. Contrast is important. And we'll maybe do that a little bit. Okay, I might have to develop that a little bit more. All right. Let's do a little bit on this pepper and a little bit on one of the light peppers. So contrast is important. So if I look here where the lighter pepper is, this is very dark. So let's start with the dark in between first. And this front edge has kind of a finger that's coming up. This edge of the surface is called a plane. And I am going to make it darker down here at the bottom to start with, but it's always easier to make it darker than it is to make it lighter. So we want to look at those fingers of the highlights that come into the shoulder. And it's easier to make adjustments to the shape and the size if I have made my values sort of medium than if I've made them dark. So you notice that you may have noticed that the shape of this highlight changed a little bit. And this whole area is going to be kind of medium for now. And we'll come up into this area. So I'm just sort of, again, establishing the form. And it's darker in here. And it's darker in here. Don't be afraid to use your eraser if you see that there's something that seems awkward. Maybe the highlights are too large. Maybe the angle is not quite right. This is going to come over here to the shoulder. This is going to come into the shoulder. This is going to change direction just a little bit here. Okay, so now that I've kind of got this established, let's come back and let's look at this highlight. This is the lightest one. This one is not as bright. So we'll start with the brightest one first. And leaving that spot. And I need to make an adjustment or add. There's one little highlight here that's kind of connected, or a continuation. And then this is going to fill in a little bit there on that shoulder. It's darker up here on the top. And darker down here to the bottom. The form should flow together, okay? Then here, there's a little bit more highlight. Remember, it wasn't quite as light, but this part is quite dark. Right here on the edge. So that's going to be quite a little bit darker there. Okay. All right, so I would work my way around the pepper, adding in those darker values. We have just a little bit of time left, so let's take a look here. Here is our highlight area on this lighter pepper. So I'm shading for form first. All right, so if there's a dip or a hollow, that's going to be darker. The highlight's going to be on the shoulder, and okay, so we are building our drawing and we've gotten it started. Okay, so just to review, we started with our highlights first, and we look for those highlights on each object. So starting with our front pepper, we started there, and we included the stem. We looked at the dark pepper behind, highlights first, and we looked at the stem. Don't forget the stems. On the dark pepper, we looked for the highlights and how the different planes or surfaces of the pepper were going. And we did the same for each of the small peppers. Okay. Once we have the highlights, then we started shading. We're going to shade, remember, for form first, and then come back and add for color second, and then for texture and value last. And it will probably take 35 to 40 minutes to finish it, and maybe a little longer if you want to do a nice job. This time, we're still not paying too much attention to the shadows on the table, but if we look at the peppers, this pepper has kind of a unique bend, so there is shadow in here. So you may include those shadows, but we're going to minimize the shadows on the table itself. Happy drawing!